All right, well, welcome everybody. I have that it is 12 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and start today's webinar, which is titled Bioplastics, Better Than Petroleum-Based Plastic? Question mark. All right, as those of you who have been on previous webinars this month are aware, my name is Maia McGuire. I am working for the University of Florida and Florida Sea Grant as an extension agent. And about 3 years ago, I started the Florida Microplastic Awareness Project. And that group made the decision that we would promote the month of September as Microplastic Awareness Month. So today's webinar is part of a webinar series that we designed for Microplastic Awareness Month. This is the final of 3 videos, but don't worry if you missed the first 2, they have been recorded and they are available on YouTube, and the links to those videos are on the plasticaware.org website in the Multimedia and Outreach Materials page. Today's webinar will similarly be being recorded. It is being recorded, and a link will be added to that page later this afternoon once I get the recording downloaded and edited. I also want to thank my colleague Lisa Krimsky. Lisa also works for Florida Sea Grant and IFAS Extension, and she has been helping me keep on track with these webinars, and she'll be monitoring the chat box. Just as a heads up, all of the participants, you are all muted, but you can enter questions in the chat box. If there's something that is sort of time sensitive, Lisa will let me know and we'll verbalize the question. Otherwise, I'll be going through questions at the end of the webinar. So feel free to write your questions in at any point, and we'll get to most of those at the conclusion of the presentation. So with that, let's go ahead and get on with this discussion about bioplastics and petroleum-based plastics. And so the first thing we need to do is define bioplastic, and that is an interesting challenge. It's not so challenging to define the word bioplastic, but there are a lot of different variations on that word that are often used, and they have slightly different meanings, although they're not always used as though they have different meanings. So we'll see terms like bio-based plastic, bio-derived plastic, biopolymer, biodegradable plastic, compostable plastic, and this can all get very, very confusing. In very general terms, if we're talking about bioplastics, we're talking about plastic-like polymers that are made from biological sources. And we're going to get into that in a bit more detail as the presentation goes on. But I want to focus a little bit on the terms biodegradable plastic and compostable plastic, because those are terms that are often applied to products, and it's not always clear what they mean. So before I get too far into that, let me go through a couple of these slides. So technically, if we use the term biodegradable, we mean that it can be decomposed with the help of microbes into basically harmless substances such as carbon dioxide and water, maybe methane, other natural elemental kind of products. Now, a lot of things technically are biodegradable because if you have enough time and you have particular conditions, then a lot of things are going to end up biodegrading. This includes petroleum-based plastics. So one of the considerations that is often made before something is labeled as biodegradable is the element of time. How quickly will this stuff decompose into innocuous substances? And very often, the time frame that is proposed when you're calling something biodegradable is in the order of months. So the European Union has a standard of within 6 months of being put into a composting facility if something completely breaks down into those innocuous compounds. it's considered to be biodegradable. The Federal Trade Commission is a little less specific. They have a somewhat vague time frame, which is within a reasonable short period of time after customary disposal. So I guess that's up to a little bit of interpretation, whether you think that's weeks, months, years. But generally, I've seen other descriptions of biodegradable using the within weeks to months kind of time frame. So perhaps less than a year might be a good generalization. But the general concept is we want this to be something that happens in a relatively short time in order for us to call a product, an item, biodegradable. We're also very aware that the environment in which something is placed is going to affect the rate at which it biodegrades. We know that things like landfills generally don't let things biodegrade, and there are studies showing that people have dug into landfills and found items that they've been able to date based on the newspapers that they were wrapped in, and these even food items were in almost their original kind of condition. They were recognizable, and yet they were 60 or 70 years old. So we know that biodegradation usually needs moisture, usually needs oxygen, and it's often temperature dependent. So warmer temperatures will speed that rate of decomposition, again, in the appropriate environment. So when we look at plastics that are labeled as being compostable or biodegradable, technically those are designed to biodegrade in particular conditions. And we'll get to who sets those conditions and what they are in just a minute. A couple of other things do affect the rate at which something will biodegrade, and that includes kind of their structure. So thicker things obviously are going to take a longer time to biodegrade. Smaller items that have a bigger surface to volume ratio are generally going to biodegrade more rapidly. The actual chemical structure of the plastic can affect how quickly it'll biodegrade, molecular weight, and other factors. So sometimes you might have to delve into the actual chemistry of the product, but we're not going to wander down that path. But just be aware that these other things can be factors affecting the rate at which something biodegrades. All right, so I mentioned standards, and there are two big international groups that set standards. There are also, there are some European standards. There are some nations that have their own sets of standards. I'm going to touch on the two big international groups, but be aware that you may see products labeled with other letters and numbers, and may need to do a little researching to figure out what those standards are and what they really mean. So I said that the biodegradability standards are set for specific conditions. So one of the most common standards that is used in labeling a biologically based plastic as being biodegradable is the ISO 17088 standard. With the ISO standards, they have the year in which the standard was adopted or revised, whatever the current standard is. So here where it has 2012, that is the year that this standard, is the most current version of this standard. And there's a lot of words here, but the main thing that I want you to notice is this is a standard for plastic that is sent to a municipal or industrial composting facility. Okay, so whether something biodegrades or not, it's going to need to be in a municipal and industrial composting facility. That's where the testing is done. So if it does biodegrade in that facility, then it can be labeled as complying with these ISO standards, ISO 17088. There are some other standards that the International Organization for Standardization has. I'm not going to delve into more of them because, like I said, this is the main one that we're using, or that we're seeing used with biodegradable plastics. Oops, sorry. The other international group that sets standards that we often see referred to with these bio-based plastics is the American Society for Testing and Materials. So even though it's an American society, it is actually international now. And again, there are multiple standards that these plastics might be said to conform with, but the most common is the ASTM D6400. And in this case, the -12 means that that is established as of 2012. And once again, you'll see that the standard refers to the product composting, biodegrading in commercial and municipal composting facilities. So with each of these standards, they have protocols saying how the company can determine whether their product meets the standards. So for that ASTM D6400, in that controlled composting facility, in that industrial and municipal composting facility, it must meet these different criteria that you see listed here. So these are quite specific, but they're also specific in terms of the environment that they happen in. So there used to be a standard for non-floating biodegradable plastics in the marine environment, but that standard, that was an ASTM standard. It was number D7081. It was adopted in 2005, but it was withdrawn in 2014, and as of last week, had not been replaced with anything yet. So in the aquatic environment right now, the main standard that is used is the one you see here, ASTM 6691, adopted in 2017. And note that this is for aerobic degradation of plastic materials in seawater at 30 degrees Celsius. So again, it's got some specific criteria. And the reason I'm kind of harping on these specific criteria is that it still leaves up to question what happens to these materials if they are not in those exact conditions. If they're in seawater, but it's not 30 degrees, or if they're in sediment in seawater, if they're in anaerobic conditions versus aerobic. So it's a little bit difficult to interpret when a product is labeled as meeting these particular standards, what that actually means will happen to it in the environment. I'm going to get a little bit more into these plant-based plastics because it's important to recognize that just because something's made from plants does not mean that it will biodegrade in that reasonable time frame. It's also important to realize that many plastics that are made from plants have basically the same chemical structure as their petroleum-based counterparts. It's just that the feedstock is different. So there are some products that are labeled as bio-PET, bio-polypropylene, bio-polyethylene. And all that means is they're going to function, they're going to act exactly the same way as the oil-based PET, polypropylene, polyethylene, but that they are derived from plant material. It's often corn, but there are many other plants and plant products that are being used to make these bio-based plastics or bio-derived plastics. One thing to be aware of is that these bioplastics are not compostable, they're not biodegradable. Technically, they can be recycled because, again, remember, they're exactly the same as the oil-based versions of these products. But sometimes they're not recognized in the collection process, especially if they're labeled as being bioplastic. They may cause confusion at the sorting facilities, where technically they are just polypropylene or polyethylene. That's not always a known or a recognized thing in the sorting process. So that can cause problems in the recycling stream. Okay, so we do have bio-based plastics that are labeled as compostable. We're probably very familiar with things like the clear cup in the picture here, or maybe the forks. These are generally made from plants, and the product is referred to as PLA. Polylactic acid is basically the chemical base. So these are not the same as those biopolyethylene or biopolypropylene. This is PLA is the chemical form. They are compostable in those industrial or municipal composting conditions. Like a lot of the petroleum-based plastics, these are thermoplastics, so that means you can melt them, you can mold them, that sort of thing. Some of the products that have been touted as being edible and therefore safe for the environment, if you read the fine print, they often say we don't recommend actually eating these, but technically they are, not going to be harmful if they are consumed. But they're, again, only going to be compostable or biodegradable in those high heat with oxygen and water type environments that you get in the commercial composting facilities. One example, a polylactic acid bottle, so something like a drink bottle made of PLA in the ocean, is expected to degrade in 6 to 24 months. So that's considerably faster than their petroleum-based equivalent, but it's not probably what you think of when you think of something as being compostable. If you put them in a home compost heap, I've tried this with different products labeled compostable, and I have not had any luck getting them to degrade in a home composting heap. So that's just been my experience with them, and that's leaving them in for a couple of years. And I'll show you some examples where people have done tests with some of these products in different environments, and you'll be able to see what the results were. The other type of biologically based plastic that I want to mention are PHA plastics. There's actually PHA and PHB. They are both derived the same way, which is from bacterial waste. So when bacteria feed on stuff, they generate waste. I was fortunate to meet Dr. Evan White. He's a postdoc up at the University of Georgia in their New Materials Institute, and he's a polymer chemist. So he's actually working on PHA. And the way he described it to me was dust particles produced by bacteria. And these dust particles, these waste products, can be collected and combined and turned into this bio-based plastic. One of the interesting things about PHA and PHB, they're very closely related. The properties of the plastic that's made from this bacterial waste dust will vary depending on the type of bacterium and also the food source, if you will, what the bacteria have been degrading as the source material. So like the polylactic acid and like most of the petroleum-based plastics, PHA is a thermoplastic. One of the interesting things about PHA is it is UV stable. So a lot of our petroleum-based plastics actually become much more brittle and broken down by ultraviolet light. So they'll physically degrade, but PHA does not seem to do that. When it's first made, PHA is typically brittle, but just like with a lot of plastics, we can add products to the PHA plastic to give it more flexibility, to change its mechanical properties. But again, be aware that when we're adding things like plasticizers, that's going to affect the potential impact that these plastics may have in the environment when they biodegrade, or when they get consumed, or when they're just in the environment. One of the sort of negative things about PHA from the manufacturer standpoint is that it tends to be that kind of cream in color. So if I go back here, you'll see that it's kind of a dirty white looking color. And that means it's difficult to make something that's, say, clear. And it's more challenging to add colors to it because you're not starting with something that's essentially clear. But the strength of PHA is that it is biodegradable in a much more reasonable time frame than the other bio-based plastics or obviously petroleum-based plastics. It can also be sort of customized so that it degrades in particular conditions. And this becomes important when I tell you about some of the products that have been made and used that are made from PHA. So it can be designed to biodegrade under aerobic conditions or anaerobic conditions, in land-based conditions or submerged aquatic conditions. Probably the biggest challenge with PHA is because we're needing to collect bacterial waste products to make it, it's hard to make large quantities, and it's hard to make large quantities affordably. And again, I'll give you some examples here in a minute. There is some thought that, and some work going on looking at whether we can use bacteria to degrade some of our petroleum-based plastics and then create PHA from that. So that could be an interesting, we've all heard about bacteria that have been found in the natural environment that degrade particular plastics. Could that then be incorporated into sort of a full circle use for these materials, where a petroleum-based plastic can then get turned into a bio-based plastic? So that'll be interesting to see. So one of the companies that has commercially produced PHA plastic, and I say has in the past tense because it doesn't seem like any of these products, with one exception, are still available, and I'm not sure if any of them are still being manufactured. But in around 2012-ish timeframe, Metabolics came out with a number of products that were made from PHA plastic. They had two different lines of PHA, Morel and Vera. The Morel was used to make some biodegradable gift cards for Target store. It was used to make this product called soil wraps. It was used to make biodegradable casings for Papermate pens. So the ink containing part, the springs, were obviously not biodegradable, but the framework that all sits in is biodegradable. That is the one product that does still seem to be commercially available, are the Papermate pens. They also made a bio-based film that they used for shopping bags, and that was the Emvera product. And from one of their slide presentations, they had a table showing the different attributes of their two bioplastics, PHA plastics, compared to conventional plastics. And what you'll see is the Morel had all of those sort of desirable properties, being able to biodegrade under various conditions, including what they refer to as cold composting. That's equivalent to a home composting type setup, so a non-commercial composter, anaerobic, aerobic, and so on. But one thing to keep in mind is, again, time frames. So with PHA plastic, and this is from conversation with Dr. White, even in an industrial composting facility, PHA plastic will still take a few weeks to biodegrade, and in a landfill will probably take a few months to biodegrade. Now that's considerably better than what we see with PLA plastic, which is 3 months in an industrial facility to up to 1,000 years in a landfill, and definitely better than petroleum-based plastic, and even better than the sort of older type of plant-based plastic, things like cellulose acetate, which is often used in cigarette filters, as well as other products. But that in the environment probably takes about a few years to biodegrade. So I mentioned that I was going to show you some pictures of these products under actual environmental conditions. So these come from Five Gyre's Better Alternative Now List 2.0, which came out earlier this year, I believe, the ban list. And what they did was they took various bioplastic products and they both buried them in a home compost environment and submerged some in basically a crate under a dock at a saltwater marina. In the home compost setup, they looked at them after 6 months, 12 months, and 2 years. And in the marine environment, they left them for 2 years and then looked at them. So I'll show you some pictures, and these are just pulled straight from their report. I didn't include absolutely everything in here, so if you want to see more, that report is readily available online. But they looked at various types of film or bags. The one at the top is labeled as oxo-biodegradable. So what that means is it's plastic, it's petroleum-based plastic that has had metal components added to it to help it biodegrade faster. This is somewhat controversial. The data are a little bit, well, I'll just say they're controversial. Whether it actually speeds up the rate of degradation is not clear. So what you see is in the series of pictures on the left-hand side is what the original product looked like. And then we have 6 months in the home compost, 12 months in the home compost, 24 months in the home compost. And then the last image on the right is after 24 months in the sea. And so you'll see that in the sea, it didn't degrade at all. And on land, it degraded, but it really just seemed to break apart into smaller pieces and didn't really seem to biodegrade. The polyethylene, so this is petroleum-based plastic in the middle row, didn't basically degrade at all under any of the conditions. And then they used a product called Mater or Mater, I'm not sure how it's meant to be pronounced, which is a bioplastic that is labeled as certified compostable. It meets the ASTM standard. And you can see that in the home compost heap and in the marine environment, this one completely disappeared. So they also looked at cups, straws, and utensils. The top one here is a PLA plastic labeled as being compostable, made from corn. But again, you see in the home compost, doesn't really go anywhere. In the ocean, maybe degrades a little bit, but there's still a lot of it there. PLA paper cup. So a lot of our paper cups and plates and bowls these days are lined with plastic. Ingeo is a common bioplastic the name of a common bioplastic that is used for lining these sort of food paper-based containers. And what you see here is that under the different conditions, the paper went away, biodegraded, but the thin PLA lining was still in evidence even after 2 years in the home compost heap and in the environment. They did look at the paper aardvark straws. So these are entirely paper. They are not PLA lined. And you see that, as expected, they disappear pretty quickly in the environment. They looked at a PLA straw. They looked at PLA spoons. And they looked at a combination plant starch and petroleum-based plastic knife. And you see these ones really didn't degrade noticeably in the land or the ocean environment. And then they did have some PHA plastics. The top line here is a sink strainer made from cornstarch. It's kind of deformed over time, but didn't really seem to lose biomass. The middle row here is those pens made from PHA. And you can see there's some loss in the home composting environment. More of it seems to be lost in the marine environment. And then the bottom line is a polypropylene binder divider. So an insert you would put in a binder that is labeled as being biodegradable. But again, you can see how it fared. We lost some color out of it, but not so much the plastic structure. A couple more PHA things. There were some beach toys that were being made, again, around 2012, 2014. I could not find those as being available anymore. But Zoe B was making these biodegradable beach toys out of PHA. They didn't do so well in the home composting environment, but in the ocean, they did completely degrade. The middle product here are polystyrene packing peanuts. And then the one at the bottom is the starch, the cornstarch-based packing peanuts. So again, those last two are as you would expect. So is PHA the future of plastics? And there are a number of challenges that PHA needs to overcome. It's got a lot of positive aspects to it. I mentioned that those products that were being commercially made are not commercially available anymore for the most part. And it turns out that Morel PHA was pretty expensive. And so now, from what I can tell, the company, which has now switched names, it's not Metabolics anymore. It is now Yield 10 Bioscience. It changed in January of 2017 to that name. And they're focusing much more on increasing crop yields, although they do on their website still have some information about PHA, and they describe that they're looking at maybe doing some combinations, adding PHA to PLA to see if that would improve the degradability of the PLA while still keeping some of the desirable aspects of the PLA from a cost standpoint. There are other companies that are working on making PHA products. I mean, this is obviously a hot area at the moment. There was a group called Full Cycle Bioplastics that was at the International Marine Debris Conference earlier this year. And they say that they can produce PHA products at a price that is competitive with petroleum-based plastic. They literally say it's 1-to-1 price. But at this point, I can't tell that they're actually producing any products. So it'll be very interesting to see if they are able to do that. And I'm sure there are lots of other groups out there working on things. So I apologize, I went a couple of minutes long. I saw a whole bunch of questions being added to the chat box. So at this point, I will see if I can actually answer any of those questions. I probably should have said from the get-go, I am not a chemist, but I have a number of really great people that I've been able to tap into to ask their expertise. So I will see what I can do. Before I get into questions though, I forgot to do the earlier poll. I'm just going to ask you to do one quick poll for me. So you should see some questions popping up on your screen. And I will open the chat box and take a look here. Question, will you send us the PowerPoint afterwards? I am happy to share the PowerPoint if you would like the PowerPoint. If you wouldn't mind just emailing me. I'm not sure I can send it out to everybody using the Zoom session. It looks like Lisa's been answering some of the questions. Great, thank you, Lisa. Can you tell us about additives to these products? Particularly interested in toxic additives such as phthalates. So phthalates, as most of you probably know, are the plasticizers that are used in the petroleum-based plastics. There are plasticizers that can be and are added to bio-based plastics as appropriate. So just like with petroleum-based plastics, if the product is, if the desire is for the product to be flexible, then the plasticizers help give it those attributes. I've tried to find out what the different plasticizers are that are used in bio-based plastics, and there seem to be several of them. There do not seem to be good studies looking at what environmental impacts those plasticizers may have. So it's a little bit difficult to judge whether the plasticizers, whether bio-based plastics are friendlier to the environment based on the fact that they don't contain phthalates, or because I don't know if these other plasticizers that are used in the bioplastics have any environmental impacts or potential impacts or not. So I'm afraid I can't give you a really great answer to that, but hopefully that helps a little bit. Okay, and I'm looking to see if there's anything else. 3D printing and PLA. Yes, 3D printing does use or can use PLA. I don't know of any studies on 3D printing and its effect on the environment. It wouldn't, the products that are made using 3D printers would still be PLA plastic. So it wouldn't necessarily need to be specific studies looking at products that are 3D printed. Other studies just looking at what happens with PLA in the environment could be applied to those 3D printed products as well. But we do have a lot of people that are using 3D printers and making a lot of things with them. I will also mention PLA is used, because it is somewhat biodegradable, it is used for some medical applications, maybe sort of screw type devices that are used in the human body where the desire is for them to degrade over time. So that is one of the ways that the medical field at least tries to take advantage of the higher degradability of PLA plastic compared to petroleum-based plastic. So with that, a reminder that this is recorded, that I will post the link on our website. Those of you that registered for the webinar, you will receive an email with that link tomorrow. So you can look for that. And not seeing any further questions, I appreciate everybody for joining us today, and I'll go ahead and call it a wrap. Thanks, everyone.